Hey guys, it's Graham. What's cracking? I am adding another book to my best of year list, and that is Dreamer of Dune by Brian Herbert. This is sort of the second part of a review that I started yesterday, but I'll just kind of summarize the entire thing here. For the last several years, I couldn't even tell you how many, I've struggled to get 10 books on the best of year list for whatever reason. I just haven't been finding as many that impressed me that much. Used to be that I would end the year with like 15, and I felt like I had to pare it down. Like I had this weird fix with there only being 10 or 12 books, and then I'd get to October and I'd only have like 8 on there, maybe 7. I was like, oh, bad year. Well, this year I've managed to average out to 1 per month. And I was getting a little bit nervous because here we are in the dying days of September and I only had 8. And then I got about halfway through Dreamer of Dune yesterday. I thought, here we go, we got another one. So as I said in the previous video, it starts out with a slight rundown of Frank Herbert's ancestry. One thing that I thought was pretty fascinating was they don't know what part of Europe Frank's ancestors immigrated from of the Herbert line. Herbert was a name that they chose when they got to America, and the original surname is lost to history. So there's a little bit of mystique and mystery to that part of him. They talk about just kind of the way that his grandparents raised him, how there was a little bit of free range, rough and tumble to it all, and you could see how he didn't necessarily learn good parenting techniques from his own parents, and he just kind of grew up wild, living outside a lot, sailing boats by himself, doing some camping by himself, and that was probably where the seed of his lifelong love for nature and stable ecology came from. And then later he would do some schooling. He ended up going to World War II and in the Navy. He was married once, and his wife divorced him when he was in the service. And he would eventually have a relationship with the daughter that they had together. And Brian Herbert frequently mentions his stepsister, or his half-sister rather, throughout the rest of the book. So she was in the picture. But for a long time, the ex-wife was chasing Frank Herbert down for alimony and child support payments and stuff because he was living the life of a writer, making almost no money and dodging creditors by just constantly moving a lot. And then he was just always writing, always trying to get short stories going. He had an agent. He was making novel pitches, but he wasn't really making a whole lot of traction. He sold the odd book here and there and the odd short story here and there, but didn't have a whole lot of success other than like one novel until Dune came out in 1965. The research period for Dune itself was fascinating. Like he read a couple hundred books over the span of 4 years, chasing just different random ideas here and there. Again, ecology, the environment. A big theme was a planet that had once been an ocean but was now nothing but sand dunes. Religion, mysticism, foreign languages, desert people, like everything that was in Dune. Like he read tons and tons of books and just did massive amounts of research on it all. All the while, Brian Herbert was growing up in an environment where his dad was very, very protective of his writing time and hated getting distracted by noises in the house and would like freak out and go to town on the kids if they made any noise at all, to the point where if he was really intensive in the process, he would even tell the kids, like, don't come home after school until dinner time. Just go do whatever. Like, don't interrupt me when I'm writing. That led to an understandably tense relationship between Brian and his father. Brian also had a younger brother named Bruce who had an even harder relationship with Frank, and that affected him for the rest of his life. But Brian had a hard time having any kind of affection for his dad as a kid, and then in his late teens, early 20s, he became an alcoholic until that relationship stabilized and things got better. I found it very heartwarming and touching, the moment in his adult life when he was finally able to kind of clear the air with his dad and say, look, I had problems with the way this was done. And his dad just saying, like, you're trying to say I'm sorry in his own way, but also like trying to help his son understand. He's like, I had to do my work. I'm going to pause right here and emphasize something that my friend Rob said earlier this year when he was reading Dune in Spanish, and he commented on the fact that Frank Herbert created a very balanced world with the technology in Dune. Like, yes, they had force fields, and they had lasers, and you couldn't shoot the lasers at the force fields or else a nuclear explosion would happen. You couldn't use the force fields on Dune because they would summon the worms. Like, everything had a positive to it and also a negative to it. And it seems like that was reflected in Frank's own life. His positive being that his writing career was obviously hugely successful. I mean, he wrote the Lord of the Rings equivalent of sci-fi novels that have stood the test of time. But the cost of that was that his family was piss poor broke, and he had just an extremely strained and difficult relationship with his kids, to the point where, like, Brian even said, he grew up later and realized, like, his dad just didn't know how to deal with kids. Like, he could talk to adults just fine, but he had no idea how to talk to and engage with kids. So that was the trade-off. And it must have been extremely frustrating then for later on in life when Brian got married and had kids of his own. Obviously, Frank Herbert loved his grandkids, but he had the same problem. If they were ever over visiting while he was writing, like, he was just as harsh on his grandkids as he was on his own children. And that caused some episodes here and there. Like, he never quite figured that out. I've seen similar things happen, we'll say, in the current day, where people try to be better with their grandkids than they were with their kids, but it must have been a generational thing there from the mid-20th century where men just didn't figure that thing out. It kind of explains how Gen X is the way that they are. But I thought that was really just enlightening and informative. He also, like, he had a very, very good, relationship with his wife. His marriage was fantastic. And he and his second wife really loved each other. I forgot to mention that he did get married again. There was a lot of focus on the fact that his mom had a chronic disease. She was given a terminal lung disease diagnosis, but she beat the odds and lived for several years after the fact. Radiation therapy and treatments and stuff weren't as refined back then as they are now, and the radiation treatments that she got for her lung disease ended up giving her a heart disease. And she ended up having to fight that and having to change her diet and constantly exercise, and it was just this back and forth constant scare thing. I will say that the medical recaps of her condition and the treatments were almost too detailed in this book. And then later at the end of Frank's own life, he also got sick and was in and out of the hospital. And the same thing, like, Brian was probably over detailed with those portions of it, just in the sense that it chronicles facts that are, I guess, relevant for Frank's history and probably a little bit relevant for the family history, but I don't think it added anything narratively or expositorily for a biography of the man, just to know that he went in on this day and they gave him this much, and then the next day they gave him this much, and et cetera, et cetera. I don't think it was good for the book overall. Like, those scenes could have been condensed and trimmed a little bit. For his mom, I understand, because it was like literally years that she was sick and fighting those problems, but with his dad, like, I think it could have been condensed a little bit more. But I digress. Like, you see the heroic lengths that Frank went to keep his wife comfortable, to provide a healthy environment for her, to rehab, to fight her illness, and the changes that he made in his own life. She was losing massive amounts of body weight, and she was complaining about being cold all the time, and so they went to great lengths to heat the house to the point where, like, everybody else was in shorts and sometimes shirtless and sweating, and she was still cold, and, like, they just made a point not to complain about it and tough it out to keep mommy comfortable. This was a family that, once they got their childhood years behind them, they all got along swimmingly. And I really, really enjoyed the chapters and the segments where Brian talked about when he was writing and publishing on his own and sharing his work with his dad, and they would collaborate on a book here and there. And Brian had his own publishing career before he ended up taking the reins on all the posthumous Dune novels. The first, well, before I go too far down that line, Frank Herbert published 6 novels in the Dune series while he was alive, and he had work ready on a 7th, but didn't get it done before he died in the mid 80s of a pulmonary embolism. And those notes, those outlines and stuff were found on computer disks probably 15 years later and would form the basis of the conclusion of the original series. And I think Kevin J. Anderson consulted on those or helped with those, or it might have been the Butlerian Jihad that he helped with. Don't quote me on that. The point is, I'm on the record saying that I really, really enjoy the original Dune trilogy. I found God Emperor of Dune to be a completely aggravating slog. And then I tried reading Heretics and I decided I'm not that interested in continuing with this series. I'll just focus on the original trilogy and go from there. Reading this book made me want to take another crack at the rest of the Frank novels, including the posthumous one that was finished or directed by his son Brian, who would have been one of those people in the world who knew the most about the process and had been there either alongside his father or in the periphery of his father as he was writing the entire series, because he would have the closest idea of what his dad wanted to accomplish with that. So I'm keen to give those another try at some point down the road. I've got the paperbacks of all the Frank novels on my shelf in the shop, so curious to try those out. In the end, like, this was obviously a labor of love. It must have taken a bit of guts to approach this with a level of honesty that Brian Herbert did, because it must be hard to talk about your family, especially when you're highlighting some of the problems and low points. His own mistakes in his past, being honest about his alcoholism when things were rough with his dad. His younger brother Bruce, like I said, he took the relationship with Frank the hardest and got into drugs and homosexuality in the 70s and stuff. And they were really concerned about him in the 80s when he was hopping around from partner to partner when AIDS was kicking off. And it was just something that, like, the family was always worried about something really bad happening to him, him catching that and it taking him out. So there's a cost to that level of success or that level of greatness, at least I think, if you achieve it a certain way. And Frank was obviously a tremendous mind and a great example, and a man who loved his craft in some ways to a fault. And he had trouble engaging with his children until they were adults. That's not me making a value judgment on that one. Obviously, it's not something that I'm going to do. It's one of those things that you hear about it, you say, I'm going to learn from this, and I would do it differently. Leave the judgment up to the man upstairs. But you get it. I think this was a very valuable book for me to read, and I appreciated the endeavor that Brian Herbert undertook in writing it, and I would recommend it to anybody. Content warning, oftentimes when there's a nonfiction or a biography like this, there will be profanity in it or whatever, just as a matter of quotation and stuff, but I think there might have been like 1 or 2 words throughout the entire thing. Other than that, like, nothing of the sort. Just the only graphic stuff was the mention of when they found out that Bruce was involved in certain types of narcotics, and there were needle talk as they were explaining like why this was dangerous and how he would have been taking it and stuff. So an easy 5 stars. I heartily recommend it. And even if you are moderately ambivalent on the series of Dune, but you're interested in biographies or writing or what have you, do check out Dreamer of Dune by Brian Herbert. I think you'll like it. Till next time, drive safe. See you out there.